the sequence diagram, how the struts works. We are all familiar that the struts begin when the user makes a request for a particular page that usually contains an extension .do. So there will be an extension something .do. When this request is intercepted by the server, it redirects the request to the action servlet, and this action servlet interprets the request. It goes to the struts-config.xml to figure out which is the appropriate action that it is supposed to take. If the input does contain some parameters, and if a action form is specified, it populates the form and then goes to the action. In the action, it calls the .execute method that takes the many parameters. We have seen the 4 parameter that it takes. Also, this execute method does return something back to the action servlet. Now, once the execute method is called, the execute method may go to the business logic or it may go to the service layer, and it may perform some work in the service layer. In turn, from the service layer, your request may go to some data layer, and you may access some data from the data layer. Once the service layer completes its work, the control is sent back to the action altogether. The action returns a action forward back to the calling servlet. In our case, this calling servlet is the action servlet. Once the action servlet receives the action forward, it determines which is the appropriate view that has to be called. So it then activates the appropriate view. The view will create a HTML equivalent output, and during this processing, the view may even take the values which are there in the service layer or the beans that are instantiated by the action. It takes those values and it returns the result back to the calling user. This is how the things work. Now let's look at the individual components within the servlet, within these struts. The first one is the controller. It is also called as this action servlet, which is the single point access to the entire struts. So entire strut starts at one point, and that is the one point entry to the struts, and it is called as the action servlet. It is the one that controls all the input that is coming into the struts as well as what goes out of the struts. The pattern that it follows is usually called as front controller pattern. The idea behind using a front controller pattern is you have one controller and everybody interacts. So this is the place wherein the user makes and gets the request. So the user makes the request, gets the response, and so on. So this is the front controller. Now what this front controller is doing is it is acting like a receptionist. It just takes the request from the user. Assume that this front controller has number of commands associated with it. So there are number of commands that are connected to this front controller. What the front controller will do is, depending upon the request, one of the command is getting executed. So it determines which is the right command that has to be executed for a given request. Why this pattern is important is you can add additional commands to the front controller. So your user who is interacting with your application doesn't have to bother about what is happening behind the scene. So they are least bothered about how many additional commands are there or which command has been pulled up. They are only interacting with the front controller. So it separates the user interface from the backend processing. So you interface for the user remains same. That means you are having a, in other words, what we usually call it as binding. So we have a weak binding between the client and the front controller. So there is one the word I'm not getting the usual word that is there is one equivalent word for that binding. It's used in your software engineering. Okay, uh, the I don't get that word. That is, it's sort of binding. What is cohesion and coupling? Okay, that is the word that is usually being used. So there is a least coupling between the client and the other side. That is, it reduces the coupling between the other external user and the interfaces. Now let's look at what are the things the action servlet is supposed to do. First of all, it retries all the requests from the user because it is following this front controller pattern. It is following the same pattern. So it gets the request and delegates it to a corresponding command. So this is what the idea we have. There is a front controller that receives the command or request and gives it to the appropriate command. In our case, there is a action servlet that gets the request and delegates it to the appropriate action classes. Apart from that, this front controller also decides which is the appropriate view or which is the appropriate JSP page that is supposed to give the result back to the user. And this is done by looking at the output of the action forward. So whenever the uh, action servlet calls the action class, the execute method of the action class, the execute method returns a action forward back to the action servlet. So that action servlet, once it receives this action forward, it looks into this action forward to determine which is the appropriate view and then gives it to the view. What are the things the action servlet is supposed to do? It is a servlet. Naturally, it will follow the life cycle of a servlet. So it is, even though we have not written it, the people at Struts have written that thing. So it is a servlet. And I've told you, servlet life cycle has that init method. And we've seen the init service and so on, destroy method. So this during the init method, it reads the configuration file. So that's the first thing the servlet, action servlet will do. So when you start your application, so when your application is deployed onto the server, what the action servlet will do is, the first thing it will do is, in the init method, it reads the information that is there in the struts configuration to find out how many actions are there and how many mapping has to be used. Then for every do get and do post, this is a specific thing with any servlet. So whenever a do get request comes or a do post request comes, it intercepts those requests and then handles it appropriately. What is the meaning of saying handles it appropriately is, once it gets a do get or do post request, it figures out which is the appropriate action that is responsible for handling the request. So this is how it goes. So when you start the application, when you start your struts, the first thing that happens is this servlet, that is your action servlet, reads the information which is there in the struts.config. Whenever a client makes a request, because it has already read this information and it is there in its memory, it is able to figure out which is the appropriate action that is supposed to handle such a request. And whenever the action completes its work, the action actually returns a action forward back to the client and back to the servlet, and the servlet determines what is the appropriate view or which view has to be selected to send the output to the user. So let's look at how do we derive this particular servlet. Now this servlet is actually fixed and given to you, and it is available under arc.apache.struts.action servlet. We have not written, I think I've already shown you that particular thing. And your web.configuration is configured to redirect any request that ends with do to the action server. So let's go back to a dummy application. What I've done is I've created a dummy application here, and in this dummy application I have there is nothing in it except that I clicked next, and I got this thing. So I've done it without wasting time. So here, this is what is your web.xml. So this is your web.xml for a typical application, and you will notice here that there is a section called as servlet. Okay. So if you, I'm going to do this one. So this is the two sections that we are interested in. There are many other sections are there. We are not going to bother about it. So this is a section within web.xml that says how many servlets are there in your application. So you have to tell the web server that your application is using so many servlets. Otherwise, on its own, the web server will not be able to figure out how many servlets are actually there. So when the request comes, at least the web server, your web application must be in a position to dispatch it to some or other servlet. And the information regarding the servlet is provided within the section servlet and slash servlet. Okay. So this is the section that specifies that there is a servlet. And what are the things which are there within your servlet? The servlet has the name. You have to tell what is the name that will be used up to activate this particular servlet, and what is the exact path, okay, where your actual class is available. So what is the full path where your servlet is there, so that it can go to that particular location and instantiate the object out of this class. So there is this class which is available under org.apache.struts.action servlet. There is a class called as action servlet dot class. We don't specify dot class because this is reference to a class itself, so it's not really required. That thing will be taken care by the server. I don't have to again specify dot class here because it is known that it's a class. Okay, so this is the information that tells the server that there is a servlet with the name action. So there is one servlet called as action. Okay. Then we have one additional. Remember, I'm not talking about the struts.xml. I'm talking about web.xml. This is not specific to the struts. It is a general thing that is meant to be used by any web application that you are writing using J2E technology. So any web application will make use of this web.xml. The struts also makes use of it. It's a special case, that's all. This is like a general settings for any web application, regardless of whether you are using struts, string, JSF, or anything for that matter. Okay. So whenever you are creating a servlet, you have to tell the server that I am using a servlet, and this is the exact path of the servlet or the class file, and this is the name that I have given it to that particular servlet. Next one is you have to specify a filter. A filter is a way in which you tell the server that if a specific type of request arrives, redirect it to a particular servlet, and that is done in the mapping. So this is a separate section. The previous one is the servlet section. This is the mapping section. In the mapping section, you have to specify the pattern. So you can specify any condition. or you can even specify an exact name. For example, you can specify that if you get a request called as emit, then you have supposed to do it. So if somebody says not and emit, then you are supposed to redirect to anything. So here what is done is it's a general case that is being specified, and that is if you get a request that ends with .do, then that request has to be given to a servlet that is given a name as action. Again, this name is yours, this name and the servlet name must match. If you want, you can change and put your name there. It doesn't make much of a difference. So what is this message? Is this message tells the server that whenever somebody gives you a request that ends with .do, check the name of the servlet and match that name with this name and go to that particular class that is provided here, activate that class. So this is what is the information that is provided. So these two information are provided. Now the next thing is, I have told you that the action servlet, when you start it during the initialization, and it calls the life cycle of this servlet. So there is that init phase. During that init phase, the action servlet reads a configuration information. Remember, the initialization of this servlet and the destruction of this servlet is solely guided by the web server. So recall what I have told you long ago. The the web server decide when a servlet has to be initialized, when a method has to be called within the servlet, and when that thing will go for the destruction. So during the initialization, you don't have the control on that initialization. So during the initialization, you have to tell the server that if you are initializing this class, during the initialization, you have to supply that configuration file, that is struts.configuration file, to this particular servlet. How do I do that thing? I have to do it declaratively, and the way in which we do it is by specifying the init parameter. So this is one section within the servlet. So this is the overall servlet with the name action, and here I am specifying that there is a configuration information that you are supposed to read it. So this is the configuration file, and you notice that struts.config.xml. This is the one configuration information you are supposed to supply it to the servlet. So that is the indication. So here you are saying that when you start the servlet, this particular servlet, during the initialization, supply this XML file to it. It knows what has to be done with that particular search.config, and the server is not really interested what it is going to do with that config.xml. You can also specify that when the server start, I want to send some name. My name is equal to something. If you want, you can do that thing. That's the initial parameter that you are supplying. The next part here is not really required. Okay, so these two are not required, and you can guess what is it is trying to do is it's a debug level. Okay, what's the meaning of saying debug level is if there is a crash, what sort of information we would like the server to provide it to us. So because we are debugging it, we will say debug option is true. That means I want a detailed description of the debug information. During the runtime, you just change this number to 1 to say that we don't want the detailed information because we have thoroughly tested our application and it is running on a real server. So we don't want to get unwanted error message, hide the debug information. So if some crash occurs within your application, detailed information will not be shown to the user because they may not be really interested in. So this is the level at which you are specifying. This is the debug level and the details level. So this has nothing to do with the application as such. This will help us during our when we design and develop our program. This thing will help us because it will, the server, in this case, you are telling the server that if there is a crash, I want all the description of what happened so that I can debug my application. The next one is load on startup. This is the number here is either 1 or 0. If you specify load on startup equal to the value of the 1 here, it means to say that we are telling the server that when you are loading, load this servlet altogether. That is the information. If you are saying 2, you are telling the server that when the first request starts, load this servlet. So if you make it as 1, it means to say that when the server is starting, when the server is booting up, load this servlet automatically. If you say it is 2, it means to say that when the server is loading, when the server is booting up, do not load this particular servlet. Instead, when somebody knocks at this particular servlet, that is when the first request arrives at this servlet, then only load it. Now, which one is good? For our debugging purpose, this is good because we are testing it and we have patience to wait for a longer time to get the server loaded, and then you know very well, if the action servlet is not started, nothing is going to start. So but we are testing our application, we are writing programs, so we can wait until the servlet starts, but you can't expect your users to wait for such a long time. When you write the real application, by now you've at least got the hint that this particular configuration file, that is struts-config.xml, it's going to get a lot of lines of code because it has all configuration information. It has the details of the forms, the JSP file, the mapping, and all the actions. All the details will be there. So there will be lines of text or XMLs that will be there inside that struts-config.xml. Now what will happen if you are going for this option? That is, if you are trying to activate the servlet, that is action servlet, for the first request. The first person to make the request will have to wait for a long time, because to start this servlet, the server will instantiate it and it will not allow the servlet to proceed until the init method is called. So when the init method is called, it's going to give a very lengthy file to the servlet. So the servlet has to read that file, interpret it, then it's going to create some objects which are required for its own work based on the configuration information which is there inside this struts-config.xml. So that means the first person to knock at that particular servlet will have to wait for a longer time. Second person onwards will not wait for it, because once that servlet is loaded, second person will get the preloaded servlet and they will proceed as it is. So the first one will get that time lag. If you want to avoid that thing, what you can do is you can just tell the server that when you start, you just start this servlet. So that servlet, whether there is a request or not, the servlet will be started and kept ready, so that anybody makes a request, automatically it is available to the user. So this is you are supposed to do it when you actually implement or when you actually put your application on a real server. You are supposed to take care of these things. Usually you don't take care of it. It is done by the administrators. So administrators will open up this particular XML file and make the changes appropriate depending upon the load on the server and so on and so forth. Okay. The next one is this information, and that is the session config. Session config is has to do with how long the session has to be there. In this case, it is for 30 minutes. So the session, if it is started, will be active for 30 minutes. That means if you come to this server and say, I want to start a session object is created and it is given to you. If you don't call back for next 30 minutes, After 30 minutes, this session, that object that was given to you, will be automatically destroyed by the server. That means session logs out automatically after 30 minutes. Now, this may be a very large number. You may like to go for 15 minutes, or you may like to go for 60 minutes, depending upon what type of application you are running. For example, if you are running a email client type of application, then going for a 15 minutes may be too less, because if somebody is typing a letter, they may go beyond 15 minutes. So 15 minutes may be too less. Okay, so 60 may be idle time. So you can't expect somebody to write a letter for 1 hour, then click on submit. But if you think that your users are doing that, you can anytime go. But what is the disadvantage of giving a very large number? Disadvantage of this is the object will be there for 16 minutes. That means if there are 10,000 clients are there, 10,000 sessions objects will be created, and they will be floating in the memory of your server. And if none of them are coming back, you still have to keep those object, that is session object, for 60 minutes. So you are losing your precious RAM on or the RAM space on your server. So decide on which is the best one that you want to go for. Again, as a developer, you usually don't have a control, because these are controlled by the administrators. The next one is the welcome files. I think I've already, I don't know if I showed you or not. This is the startup file. So when your application starts, it's going to automatically call index.jsp. So if you want some other thing to start, if you have written the Visual Basic kind of application, you know very well the startup form. You can set one form as a startup form, and this is the same thing. You are setting up one of the file as the startup file. Okay. So then we have a lot of configuration information. I will not bother about that configuration information. So this is how. Let me go back. This is how the action servlet reads the configuration information. Okay. What is there in this configuration information? The next one. So we said that the servlet or the controller will read that particular struts.config.xml. What is there inside it? It has everything. Okay. It has the list of fields that you are going to use, list of JSP file that for which you have to redirect the forwards, and list of actions which are there within your entire struts application. So that means to say that it is the most crucial file within your application. So if your struts.config is corrupt, or if you have not written this struts.configuration file properly, then your application will definitely misbehave, and you will not be able to easily figure out what is going on, because it's very difficult for you to trace back what is going on. However, there are many built-in tools that will help you out with the debugging. So let's look at what are the things which are there in the struts.config. Okay. The first important thing, struts.config, even though the name is always, any book you refer, everybody is going to call it as struts.config, but according to the team that has created struts, this name is not mandatory name, and its location is also not mandatory. You can change the name of this file as well as the location of this file. If you notice in the web.config here, somewhere we are specifying what is the name of this configuration file. This name could be xyz.abc or anything. It could be anything, and it need not be always inside webin. It is not mandatory. Okay. Why do we have to use it? Suppose if you feel that a hacker is going to hack into your application, and if they get a hold on struts.config config, almost most of your application logic is known to the hacker. So if you want to hide that thing and if you don't want to keep it at a default location, you are free to do it. Okay, so it is not mandatory that you are supposed to give struts.config and you are supposed to keep it at that location. You are free to keep it at any location. And this is what I have already told you. I have already shown you in the real example. In order for this particular configuration file to be read, you have to go to web.xml, give the name, specify the location and specify the configuration information, and you notice over here in real life load on startup is kept as 1 to indicate that the controller will load immediately during the boot up of the server. Now let's look at what are the different sections which are there inside the struts-config.xml. So altogether there are 7 sections are there. The first one is the data sources, form bean, global forward, action mapping, controller, message resources and plugin, out of which form bean, global forwards, action mapping are the regularly or generally used one. The others are there, but we usually don't touch these things at a rare cases. Whereas the form beans, the global forwards, and the action mapping is regularly being used. So this is the general configuration of a struts.xml. You have, if you notice over here, this one does not show the data sources. Generally, we don't use them, and even if we use them, we will use it only once. Every now and then, we don't touch these sections. Whereas the form bean section is usually touched. Global exceptions is part of this section alone, and global forwards are also being touched. Exceptions not being heavily being used up. Mapping is definitely we are using. We have already used that thing, and you know very well. Every action you will have to have a mapping, so that these sections are regularly being touched. Then we have controller and message resources. So you may get a question in the examination. Explain the struts.config.xml. That could be a full-blown 10 marks question. So you will have to explain the entire structure as it is without making a mistake. You will have to start from this point. Okay. It is starting from this point, dot type, as well as it's an XML. I don't know whether that's available there. Whenever you are writing the XML, I told you read an XML book. All XML must begin with this tag. If you are starting a file without that tag, even though it's a remark tag, it is not considered to be a XML. That's why I told you, please refer any XML book. I will not be talking anything on XML because it's a very lengthy topic altogether. So let's go to the different section. This is the sample that you usually see, and usual thing that we bother about is this one. Where is the mouse? The form bean, global forwards, and action mapping. These are the usual one, but does not mean that we can't touch the other one. Let's start with the individual one. So there are, I told you, there are altogether 7 sections are there. We will go from one section to the other. So let's start with the data sources. The name itself says the data sources are used to specify the sources, the locations of the databases and the pools that you want to use for your struts application. So this is a centralized location wherein you disclose that this driver has to be used, this database has to be used, and all the details regarding your data sources are provided under this. Because data sources vary, the parameters that are required by the different databases vary from one another. There are no specific tags which are available. So the number of tags that you are going to place here as well as their properties vary. So what they have done is, in order to set the property, they have a tag called as set property. So all the parameters has to be placed within this set property. So what are the things that typically provided here? One is the driver class that you want to use it, the access to it, and maybe the description. These are provided. For example, one of the data source type is apache.commons.dbcp basic data sources and set of properties. For example, so this is one example that is being shown up. It's a PowerPoint, so I am not getting enough space to show the content. You will notice that data sources is, there is S here. This is data sources. That means you can have more than one data sources. Under this sources, you have data source. So this is major section. So you can have many data source placed under data sources. So data sources is the outermost part. So you can imagine you have the entire thing is data source, full-fledged. Inside this, you have many data sources. Okay, you can have any number of data sources. One of them is typically being shown here. Okay, so you can have, if you want to place one more data source, you have to create data source and close it with the data source. So everything under one. So here we have data source type is apache.common.dbcp DBCP, and the driver name here we are trying to use the PostgreSQL, and the username, password, maximum active connections, maximum waiting time, default commit, you are already familiar, default read-only value. These are all specific to the databases, and how to get the details. They are available under this section. So that means all the database related information is available under data sources. Next is the one that we have already used, and that is the form B. We are already familiar. The request that you are sending to the server or to the action servlet, the request is taken and it is placed inside a form bean, or it's called, also called as action form. Okay. The details of this action form will be available under a section form B, and optionally you can specify the properties. We have not done that example in the lab. You can, what we have done in the lab is we created a class called as action class, action form particular, and then we added the getters and setters directly into that Java class. If you don't want to do that thing, there is the other shortcut for doing it, and that is you can create the entire definition of the action form in the XML itself. So I can create a XML action form and put the properties for that. So how do I do that? Let me go to the struts.config, and you notice that this is the one, I think I saved it. I should not have saved that information. Okay. This is the blank one. So we have form beans. In the usual way, how we used to do is whenever we create a form, when we want to add a form to our application, let's go here and let's try to add a form to our application. So I'm going to add a action form. I'm going to call this as, just tell you that employee. You've done it in the, this is the form bin, and you add the form and you can add the properties. What are the things that are there? The form bin has the attributes like name and the class of the form. So I don't know why it is taking too much of a time to get something done. So there is a name of the form and there is a type of the form. Type is the class, fully qualified type. And again for the property we have name and type. For example, we have a form called as toDetails form. The type of it is dynamic form. I'm going to show that how to create a dynamic form, and the property name and the type, name and type. So for example, this is a array of string. The first one is the array. So this is a dynamic form. This is not the form that you used to create in the lab. In the lab, what you have done is you've created a actual Java class, and then you wrote the details, even though you have not done anything for that matter. Where is that information? Okay, you notice here that was blank, and when I added the form, there is a name and there is a type. So the type is the name of the class, and what is that type refers to? Type is the actual name of the class. This is com.myapp.struts, and the name of that particular class which is being used of. So this is if you have a class like the ordinary Java class. And what you have done in the lab is you went here and you added some properties and you added some getters and setters. Now what if you don't want to do this, and if you want to declare the form directly in the XML, it is possible. To add a form in the XML, you will have to go here, right click on it, and then say I want to add a action form B directly in the XML. Give a name, say student form, give a name to it. Usually we used to specify the class name here. Now here there is no Java class associated with it, so I'm going to say that it is derived out of Dyna action form. This is a dynamic form that is created on fly. So when I add it, you are going to notice that it has already added the same kind of things. The name, what I have given in the for this one, the same it has done. And you notice that my employee class, this was the Java class, and it said that the type of it is something of this, okay, that is employee action form. Whereas here it is saying that student form is of type Dyna action form. Why it is saying Dyna action form is this is a dynamic form. It will be created on fly. It is not created when you are writing the program. When the application runs on fly, it's going to create this class. That's why it is called as dynamic form. Now here in my employee form, I have the name and number, or in the last class we had a username, address, phone number, and so on. These are all the attributes of the employee form. Now what if I want to add a attribute to my student? If I want to add a attribute to the student, this is not there. This class is not there. That Java class is not there. So entire declaration has to be done within the form itself. So I'm going to right click on it and I'm going to say I want to add a property to the B. So when I do that thing, it's going to ask me what is the property name. I'm going to say the name of it is the student name. The type is this one, okay, and the default value is a new student. That's the default value that I want to set. If I click on OK, you will notice that here what it has done now is it has created that bean with the student, but it has set the property called as name of type string. This is identical to you are going to a class and you are creating a action class, and then you are typing maybe private string name, and then getting the getters and setters for them. So this is identical to that, but that is done on fly. Whereas in this case, that thing is done on fly. You can have any number. So if you want to have the one more property, I can go here and say I want to add a property, and let's say I want to add a property called as register number. It's of type int, and I don't want to specify any default value for that. Click add. You notice that it has created initial value is not there. It has created a register number, and the type is int. So you are creating on fly. So this section, form bean section, contains the declarations for the bean. It says what is the name of the bean and what is the class which is responsible for using that name. Or in other words, this is like a variable name. It's like when you create it, it's a variable of type Dynaform. It's like if you want to create a employee class, how do you do it? If you want to create a, let's say a simple, I have not created this, employee emp equal to new, and you do something. This is a variable name. So it's like a name that you are giving. The same analogy is used up. That's the name that you are thinking of using there. Okay, let's go to the next section. So I've explained this much is enough for the understanding. The next one is global forward. The global forward is commonly used forwards. Okay. What is the meaning of saying commonly used forwards? For example, if there is an error, regardless of the action in which that error occurs, you want to forward them to a particular page. So it's a global redirection. You might have seen in your Facebook or any other, when you log out, you are redirected to a startup page. That's global. You can log out from any part of your application, but still you will be taken to a global location. That is, when some event occurs, regardless of the module in which that event occurs, you want to have a global redirection. For example, there is an exception and you want to go, usually if you have an exception, there is a section called as global exceptions, but let's say that there is an exception, and globally you want to send them to a particular page or a particular location. In that case, we go for global redirection. Okay, the section remains same. What we are doing is we specify the forward, and for example, I think they have given a simple example here for global forwards. Okay, name is welcome, and where you want to redirect. So in this case, you notice that it is not redirecting to a JSP page. It is redirecting to a .do. Okay, it's taking you to some other module. Again, whenever you are doing a redirection need not be always to a JSP page. It could be for some other action. So you can chain the action one after the other. So you have one action, next action, next action, next action, one after the other. So this is called as the usually we say it as chaining of the actions. You can do that thing. For example, one of the module does one part, then you are not giving the output to the user. Instead of giving it to the user, you again give it to some other module for doing some extra work, and finally the output is given to the user. That this is always possible. And here you notice one of such example is you are globally redirecting into some location. For example, when the error occurs, you may not like to send them show a JSP page directly as it is. You may like to log that error in some location on the server so that you can check what type of error that has occurred, and then redirect to the output to some JSP page. This is possible. Okay, so let's go to the next one, and that is what is there in the global forward. Again, I think I don't have to explain too much regarding this. What is there in this one is there is a name and there is a path. It's a name that is given and the location where it has to be redirected. There is one additional parameter that comes into picture, and that is context relative. What is the meaning of saying context relative? It just takes true or false as the value. If you say context relative is with relative to the current page, you are specifying the redirection page. So if you are there, say for example, if you are there here at this location, relative means with respect to this page, where is the redirection? What is absolute is regardless of this page, you are always starting from the root. So you have a root here. It's like always absolute location. You are in the Unix. You are already familiar with this concept: relative reference and absolute. Okay. Absolute is always starting from the root. The location is fixed because it is always starting from the root. The relative is it depends. So from here, if you say one step up means you are going to reach here. That is this package. From here, if you say one step up, you are going to say web.in. So you are just saying one step up from the current context, one step up or one step down, or with respect to this location, the redirection. So the redirection could be anywhere. So that means to say that, for example, when the error occurs, if you say that context is relative, then it need not be always the same page that is being shown up. It may be some other page. So, for example, you may have a redirection here, very close by. So, in that case, it is possible for us to specify different error messages depending upon on which location that error has occurred. If you say it is global, that is context is false, in that case, you're just saying that regardless of it, there is only one page that's going to be redirected. I will continue with this.